is our Dharma? What is our quest? Welcome to Dharma Nights. Today I wanted to do a little bit of storytelling. My name is Matt. I'm the host of the podcast, and I don't often do too much storytelling here, although I'd like to do more of that in the future. So starting today, what an excellent opportunity to get that little periodic trend going. The story I want to tell today is about some of the events that took place over this weekend when I was at a big sort of art party, right? For those who are not initiated or don't know what this is, there's a big sort of off-brand style of Burning Man in Miami, Florida called Love Burn. And these burn festivals are basically a chain of lots of voluntary art installations and free giving expos and basically like a big playground for kids, but also with mutual responsibility. And it would take a lot longer to kind of unpack all the details. But the short version for our purposes today is that it's basically a huge sprawling party with lots of interactive art exhibits. So in this particular circumstance, like this party, I got to see one of my nearest and dearest friends who I haven't seen in many years. And this is someone who I used to collaborate a lot with in writing and art. And I was in several bands with him. Very, very near and dear to my heart. And he's a real fascinating guy. I'm not going to get into too many details about his personal life because I haven't really let him know that he's going to be the subject of my podcast today. So I'll try to keep him at least anonymous enough to where we can tell a good story. But this friend of mine, aside from being an outrageously talented artist and musician, is also a very capable human being in many ways. So he worked in trades for many years, so he has a lot of practical hands-on skills that are like quite valuable in a pragmatic sense. And this makes him both one of the most creative people that I know and one of the most practically skilled people that I know, because if there's some sort of manual skill of construction or fixing things or whatever, chances are he's got at least some level of functional knowledge of it, right? But he's also been the sort of person who has been quite capable of going into scary situations and helping to like protect people or defend people. Or like negotiate really scary situations with people who are like poised to do violence or whatever else. And in his current community, he lives in sort of a blended like art commune / like industrial commune. So a bunch of like trade people, but also a bunch of artist weirdos live there. And in this sort of leadership role, he's often had to negotiate lots of very scary situations because he's basically running it along with one or two other people, but he's like the guy, right? So throughout his life, he's been put in many situations where he's had to be prepared to like defend people using force, and he's also off and on exhibited the ability, willingness, and successfully carried out sort of missions to kind of pluck people out of very, very scary situations, like where like people could have killed him, right? So seeing him at this big art party was something that I didn't really know that my soul needed until we got there. Just because in my own current life, I don't really spend as much time as I would like around my creative friends or people who I've done a lot of like art collaboration with or whatever. And that's kind of like a missing piece in my own personal life right now that I would like to amp back up. It's just at my current stage of life, it's kind of hard to, and like where I live and everything, it's a little bit hard to find those things, like those opportunities and those people where I can make such a thing happen while also trying to balance like, you know, professional responsibilities and all that other stuff. So in this particular case, this makes one of these encounters just so outrageously valuable to me because I get to refill that artist weirdo part of my soul with another like artist weirdo adventurer, right? But since it had been so long since I saw this person, I tried catching him up on some of the things that I've been up to and doing. And we also like to catch each other up on the things that we've been thinking about, right? Like philosophically or, even things that we've been embodying philosophically, right? So while we were, let's just say, like imbibing, party libations and in a certain like warm state of fairly innocuous party kind of intoxication, just enough to be able to have a good time and all that other good stuff. I caught him up on this idea of knighthood that I've been playing with a lot lately. And that's been one of the informing backbones of this particular podcast, right? Because he had mentioned, I listened to your podcast, like one or another episode of it. And he said that he really enjoyed it. So that kind of got me to talking about some of the things that I've been thinking about that form the conceptual backbone of this. And one of those things is carrying yourself as a knight. And that can mean a lot of different things. And it can take a long time to unpack. And if someone listens to this podcast for long enough, they will probably absorb some of those ideas more or less accidentally, whether or not they set out to do that, right? But for me, one of those ideas is sort of knightly responsibility, right? So here I am. I'm a martial artist and a martial arts instructor. And I didn't set out to do this, but it definitely dawned on me one day. I'm like, wow, I'm teaching people how to efficiently murder people if they so set out to do such a thing, right? And this is something that all my other BJJ and judo instructors do as well. It's not that, but I don't think all of us really think about that idea consciously. And we don't always like treat that like a loaded gun that, we're just sort of like, hey, open for business, come learn how to efficiently murder people. But part of that is because it's done in such a playful atmosphere that it seems so alienated and so remote from the origins of what all these arts basically teach. But, if we're talking about jiu-jitsu and judo, these things descended from samurai battlefield arts. They descended from means and methods used to maim, kill, whatever, disable people on the battlefield, even if you had lost your weapon or if they were armed and you were not, or if neither of you were armed or whatever. And even like things that you could do, even if they're wearing like very dense armor. Okay. So that's where these things developed. And in the modern setting, we kind of seem to forget about that just because it's such a playful, fun activity. But that's what it is. So at some point in the relatively recent future, or past rather, I got in the habit of extracting an oath from any student who I had spent any significant amount of time training. And sometimes the oath is a little bit more simple. Sometimes it's more complex depending on who's in front of me. But the simplest version of the oath is, do you swear to only use your capability for violence in defense of yourself or others? And they say yes. But then I usually tack on to that another part of it, which is, do you swear to use your productive capabilities in defense of and in support and building of yourself and your community? And that means something very different. Because one is sort of like, I'm prepared to use violence if I have to, and it's regrettable that I do, right? Meaning like I would never just do this to satisfy my feelings. I would never do it to enact a vendetta. I would never do it for fun, whatever. And I'm not talking about having a sport fight. That doesn't really apply. I'm talking about like, that like categorically the use of violence is something that is not consensual. Generally speaking, like the use of, if someone has agreed to have like a martial arts match with you, you have agreed to a sport activity where there are rules and structures. But using any of these things for violence means like, there's a contest of wills and it's not for sport. And someone is going to get hurt in this process. But that covers the first part of that little oath about violence. The second part of that oath is, we don't just collect skills and knowledge for how to destroy things, right? Some martial arts communities, I think they do that. But if you have a good one, from time to time, you'll get roped into doing something charity-based or whatever, where you and your school are like, oh, we put on this tournament for charity, or, oh, we rallied some of our people to volunteer some hours or whatever. Or even just as individuals within that group. It's to be hoped that some of them, because they have habituated themselves to being in such a tight-knit community, that from time to time they will share skills with the other students in that dojo or with the other people in their little orbiting community. That's a hell of a thing to assume, but in my experience, it seems to be what happens. But getting people to actually make an oath to do those things takes it a little bit further. So my friend and I were sitting there enjoying our party, catching up on all the things that we'd been up to, and that's one of the things that I was catching him up on. Like, oh, here's one of the things that goes into my desire to make this podcast and the things that I'm talking about. And I mentioned that I'd make my students take that oath. And, as we're there just kind of partying along and I'm explaining why it's important to do that and all that sort of thing, I very sort of by the way asked him, like, have you ever taken an oath like that? And I asked because I know he's never trained the martial arts that I've trained, but he's definitely, like, along the way learned how to scrap and has demonstrated that knowledge, right? So, and he's often done it on behalf of his community, like defending his community, defending people who can't defend themselves, all that sort of thing, right? But when I asked him if anyone had ever actually made him take an oath like that, he said, like, he kind of paused for a moment and said, no, just myself to myself. And then the pause just kind of sustained for another moment. He's like, but that's not good enough, is it? And I hope at that moment I didn't say, no, it's not good enough. I kind of left it open, like, well, it can be nice to have someone else actually extract that oath. So it's binding to someone. So in that moment, I asked him, like, would you like me to knight you? Like, I'm not a lord. I don't have a lordly title from somewhere, but by dint of my judo black belt, if not even my jiu-jitsu black belt, I do, in a sense, behave as if I have been knighted because of all of the values that Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, put into the art of judo, which by the time it hit BJJ, a lot of that stuff went by the wayside, right? But there's a very strong moral development aspect in judo. And when Westerners first met Jigoro Kano and his high-level students, they didn't call him his gym full of wrestlers. They called them his knights, right? And that's something that struck me when I read that. And I forget where I read it, but there's a lot of old jiu-jitsu textbooks from around that time. There's a lot of old catch wrestling textbooks from around that time where they actually talk about Jigoro Kano and his students, and they don't refer to him as a bunch of wrestlers. They refer to them as knights. And I think part of that is like the translation of like samurai knights, whatever, but that, if you were in a karate class as a kid, they may have also made you take some Bushido oaths, right? But for some reason, we see, it struck me that we ask kids to do this, and we don't ask adults who are actually in a position to use these skills in a dangerous way and to use them for the wrong reasons. Like, almost no one that I know actually makes them extract that oath. And I even discussed that on Facebook sometime in the last year or two, and a lot of my peers kind of poo-pooed it, but some of them who had been in the military actually, particularly like some of the elder guys who were also judoka and like old Japanese jiu-jitsu guys, or a handful of them were Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys, they immediately chimed in and said, yes, what a great idea. And then of course a handful of others are like, that's not binding in any way. Why would that matter? Blah, blah, blah. Like, you can't enforce that. And there's always going to be people who say those sorts of things, right? But since I've been extracting that oath, I've actually gone through the motion to make it meaningful, to say, like, I have thus knighted you, right? Like, so I make them take that oath if I have like a samurai sword handy, I literally use the samurai sword to knight them. And if I just have my hand, I use that as my sword, because I want it to have like an atmosphere of meaningfulness when they take the oath, to say like, this isn't just something that we're casually doing because we're at a party or because it's funny or it's silly or it tickles some funny bone in us. It's something that I mean 100%. Like 100% of me with all my being means it. And in this particular moment, I could tell it was very meaningful for him too, because, you know, I had him kneel. I actually made him take that oath. I knighted him. And then not only that, but one of the people that we were with is our dear friend who's also a Kabbalah high priestess, right? She's like this entrepreneur in her day-to-day life, but she's also like a Kabbalah high priestess and presides over ceremonies and stuff like that. So we asked her if she could bless the knighting as well, just to make it that much more meaningful. And within seconds, like less than a minute after doing this, we were going from one part of the party to another. And this is in an outside beach setting, by the way. And in one of the dance floors, a crab had walked up to like where there were a bunch of people, and he was kind of in danger of getting stomped on. And within seconds of swearing to use his abilities to defend, he scooped up this crab very carefully from amidst the dance floor and walked it all the way over to the beach setting where it could kind of be safe. And as he was walking back up and we were going from point A in the party to point B in the party, I said, so I just want to point this out. It's been literally less than a minute and ... And before I even got to finish, he was like, yep, I know. And for the rest of that night, we had already had a lot of fun. We had already danced around. We had already done a lot of the fun art installation stuff. But for the rest of that night, I could tell he was a little preoccupied. And maybe that he was like thinking about that. But some of the other things that I had mentioned throughout the course of the night about why this notion of knighthood matters to me so much, in addition to the reasons I just mentioned, is also rooted in the reason why the story of the Arthurian knights appeals to me so much. And I'm not going to be able to fully expand it in just this episode, but one of the facets that I mentioned is that, you know, the knights will often have this opportunity to reconnect with their faith, even if it's in a very different form. So, for example, if we're talking about the Wolfram von Eschenbach version of Parzival, he is very disillusioned, or at least doesn't seem to be very invested in like the Orthodox church structure. But throughout the course of the story, he has this sort of up and down journey in his faith. And the strongest parts of his faith that he exhibits are through encounters with holy fools who aren't even official priests. They're just like sort of examples of the archetype of the person who's a little touched by craziness, like a hermit who has some aura of holiness about them, even though they're not ordained, they're not anything, but they have this very transcendent and strong moral center. And one of the big parts of the way that the knight's faith takes shape is in how they perform within human relationships and how they exalt love and compassion, and how one of the key moments of a lot of these Grail stories is when they reach out with a spontaneous act of compassion to heal someone else or to show concern. It's not necessarily one of the moments where they use their skills of violence to overcome. Although there are certainly many parts of those episodes where they are called upon to do things like that. But the key moment in these stories is the moment that renews some sort of faith that they have, not by going through empty forms or rituals of like catechisms or whatever else, or even the particular image of the Christ, but through a Christly act where they behave with compassion, and where also they bind communities together by love, or they defend love, or they find some way to rescue someone else's, like another couple's or potential couple's peril, where for whatever reason they're not able to love one another. Like maybe one of them is kidnapped, or maybe there's like some oppressive uncle who's like keeping the marriage from happening or whatever. sometimes their moment of faith is by doing something in defense of love and true love, not just like marital love that's dictated by the needs of the community or whatever, but like an actual authentic, spontaneous, romantic love. So the faith of a questing knight in these stories is very often that of renewal of human relationships. So that's, another thing that can appeal to people like myself and like my friend who I've been talking about here, because we've both had moments of where, like, prolonged moments in our life where there's this sort of disillusion spot that looms large throughout our lives. That's like the shadow cast by something where a community-driven faith was like very empty, or actually something that was malicious. Like, let's say, for example, like a bad church organization that abused and mistreated people, or even the way it's structured is built to abuse, exploit, and alienate people. Like, we've both had somewhat similar experiences there, except his were way more extreme than mine. And part of the reason why this nightly journey appeals to me so much is because in the process of whatever quest they undergo, they're usually not quite finished with their quest, whatever the nominal quest was, until they have repaired a community, or they have done something to strengthen the bonds of other people's love, or they've done something to heal someone else. And then and only then is their particular quest, in some sense, completed, right? And it is especially the case if they've already failed one of these quests and they've had to wander in despair for a long time in the shadow of broken faith, or despair because they think that whatever their quest as they conceived of it before, it seemed like it was no longer possible to complete or whatever. And that's the kind of the wandering in the wasteland motif, right? And there's a lot more things that I'm not going to have enough time to explain in the scope of this podcast, but that somehow or another, in the middle of dancing, in the middle of just kind of like having a fun time at a party, while we were both, maybe a few sheets to the wind, somehow or another I had the space to communicate a lot of these ideas in a way that I think my friend kind of like was able to bite into a little bit. And just watching him literally within moments of taking that nightly oath and being blessed by our priestess friend, watching him rescue that crab, like literally he probably saved that little crab's life from getting stomped on by a bunch of like drunk party people or whatever. That was an especially wonderful moment for me, and I hope it was for him too. But this is one of those sorts of things where if you've never actually gone through the motions of having someone bind you to a renewed sense of purpose and responsibility for whatever skills that you have, something like that is increasingly unpopular these days in a very cynical age, right? Because everyone knows that there's like oaths like that can be broken very easily. It's something that can be thought of very cynically in this day and age. But if you've ever actually had a friend who loves you extract an oath like this, it can be a very powerful thing. And just by way of trivia, I had him actually exchange that same oath-taking act with me and had him walk me through the very same oath, which I took. And it's not the first time I've done that, but just to sort of reinforce the mutually binding aspect of it. So, I would be very interested to check in with my friend from time to time and just kind of see like how that's sat with him and whether or not that's influenced any of his like thoughts or actions going forward. But if nothing else, I would say that the price extracted from that oath of saving that little crab's life was like such a micro moment of redemptive love for the world, for me anyway. Certainly in the view of a Buddhist or whatever else, they can kind of get this idea right away. Like there's no difference between that crab's life and one of our life. Like it's a living being. But even just at that level alone, those things are extraordinarily special. And, I plan on continuing, certainly for my martial arts students, if I've spent enough time with them, I plan on continuing to extract that oath from them just because for me it's very meaningful. If I could somehow expand that notion to other people and walk them through the same thing where they're like officially by another human being sworn into the responsibility of using their skills both defensively and proactively to preserve and to help build. And, if as many contexts as I can figure out how to stoke that idea of knightly responsibility throughout the world, that's something I'm kind of looking forward to doing. So to all my listeners out here who may have gotten something from this, hopefully something about it struck a chord. And if my friend happens to be listening to this, I hope you enjoyed me telling the story. And I have some kind of idea kicking around for a follow-up conversation about this, especially if we ever see each other in person. But I'm going to let that one marinate for a little bit. So thanks all.